One number on a screen can start a war that nobody intended. Today, 33 tiny mistakes, missed signals, and bad calls that changed everything. We've got a sleeping wireless operator, a unit mix-up at Mars, and a bunker alarm. And stay for number 33, where a single decision stops a chain reaction in time. If you've ever said, "It's probably fine," this video is about to disagree. The missing binoculars key on the Titanic. The Titanic struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912, and more than 1,500 died. High in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee searched black water without binoculars. The binoculars were locked inside a small bridge locker that nobody on board could open. Second Officer David Blair had been reassigned at Southampton and accidentally left with the key. That night was moonless, and the ocean looked like polished glass from the lookout platform. Fleet later testified binoculars could have revealed the iceberg sooner, not magically, just earlier. Instead, he rang the bell only when the pale outline finally grew out of darkness. Down below, officers tried hard turns and engines, but physics had already made up its mind. A forgotten key turned a routine watch into history's most famous late warning. 2. The Californian sees rockets and does nothing. On April 15, 1912, people froze in the Atlantic, while help sat frustratingly close. The steamship Californian had stopped for ice, with Captain Stanley Lord resting nearby. Second Officer Herbert Stone watched white rockets rise and burst from a distant ship. White rockets were widely used as distress signals, not party tricks, even in 1912. Stone reported them, and the crew tried a Morse lamp, but got no clear reply. The wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had already gone to bed and was not awakened. Lord hesitated, asked about company signals, and chose caution over charging into ice. Meanwhile, Titanic's lifeboats drifted, and the screams faded as hypothermia took over. Those brief rockets became the night's cruelest fireworks, seen clearly, answered slowly. 3. The wrong turn that found Gavrilo Princip. On June 28, 1914, 2 bullets in Sarajevo helped ignite World War I. Archduke Franz Ferdinand survived a bomb attempt earlier, then chose to visit the wounded. The new route was not clearly communicated to his driver, Leopold Loschka, amid confusion. Loschka turned onto the original street, realized the mistake, and stopped to reverse. Right there stood Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb teenager, stunned by impossible luck. He had drifted to a nearby shop after the failed plots, thinking the day was over. When the car stalled in front of him, he stepped forward and fired at close range. Sophie and Ferdinand collapsed, and Europe's alliances clicked into motion like falling dominoes. A simple navigation error parked history's most wanted target directly beside his assassin. 4. B-59's nuclear torpedo vote. On October 27, 1962, a cramped Soviet submarine nearly turned a crisis into apocalypse. Submarine B-59 was deep near Cuba when U.S. destroyers dropped signaling depth charges. Inside, the air was stifling, batteries were low, and radio contact with Moscow vanished. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed war had already started and ordered a nuclear torpedo prepared. Soviet rules required agreement from 3 senior officers before launching that special weapon. Savitsky agreed, the political officer agreed, and the room felt like a sealed furnace. Then Flotilla Chief Vasily Arkhipov refused, insisting they surface and re-establish contact first. The submarine surfaced, messages were exchanged, and the world never learned this by headline. One dissenting vote mattered more than any torpedo tube because it stopped the irreversible. 5. A press secretary says, effective immediately. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall cracked because a spokesman fumbled a timeline. East German official Günther Schabowski walked into a press conference with barely read notes. The government planned new travel rules, but intended a controlled rollout with conditions. A reporter asked when the new rules would take effect. and cameras locked on him. Schabowski squinted, stalled, and said the change was effective immediately, without delay. East Berliners heard that live and poured toward checkpoints with passports and hope. Border guards had no clear orders, and the queues swelled into a human tide. Late that night, overwhelmed officers opened gates, and strangers climbed concrete together. A sloppy answer on live television became a sledgehammer that broke an empire's symbol. 6. Seth MacFarlane misses Flight 11. On September 11, 2001, Seth MacFarlane lived because his timing was slightly wrong. He was scheduled for American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles that morning. The night before, he drank heavily, and a departure time was reportedly given incorrectly. Between the hangover and confusion, he arrived late enough that the gate had closed. He rebooked and waited in the terminal, thinking only about being annoyed and tired. Flight 11 was hijacked and struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. MacFarlane later described how it felt unreal, like the brain refusing to accept it. 7. Apollo 11's 1202 alarm go call. On July 20, 1969, the moon landing nearly ended because a computer complained loudly. During Eagle's descent, alarms flashed 1202 and 1201, meaning the guidance computer was overloaded. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin heard mission control chatter turn sharp and urgent. In Houston, guidance officer Steve Bales had seconds to decide, abort or continue landing. Weeks earlier, Bales and software expert Jack Garman had rehearsed this exact alarm scenario. They knew it could mean too many tasks, yet the computer still navigated correctly. Bales called go, and Armstrong kept descending while fuel ticked down like a metronome. 12 minutes later, Armstrong stepped onto the surface, and the world exhaled together. A rehearsed note about a cryptic code became the thin thread holding history's climax. 8. Apollo 13's duct tape CO2 fix. On April 14, 1970, 3 astronauts survived because engineers invented deadly arts and crafts. After an oxygen tank exploded, Apollo 13's crew retreated into the lunar module to live. Carbon dioxide began rising because the module was built for 2 astronauts, not 3. The command module had square lithium hydroxide canisters, while the lunar module used round ports. That meant the scrubbers could not fit, like trying to plug a brick into a bottle. Mission Control dumped supplies on a table and listed only materials the crew already had. Cardboard, plastic bags, duct tape, and a spare hose became a life-saving adapter. Ground teams talked Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes through every step calmly. The improvised filter worked, and the trip home became a triumph instead of a tomb. 9. Hannibal refuses to march on Rome. In August 216 BC, Rome survived because Hannibal chose rest over the finishing blow. At Cannae in southern Italy, the Carthaginian army encircled and shredded a massive Roman force. Ancient sources describe tens of thousands killed, with survivors fleeing in panic toward the city. Hannibal's cavalry commander Maharbal urged an immediate march, sensing Rome's gates were practically open. Hannibal hesitated, citing exhausted troops and supply problems after the blood-soaked victory. The decision looked sensible in camp, where men needed food, bandages, and sleep. Rome used those days to regroup, raise new legions, and avoid a single decisive siege. Years later, Carthage lost the wider war, and Hannibal's genius became a tragic legend. A pause after the greatest win turned into history's loudest what-if, echoing for centuries. 10. The Mona Lisa walks out of the Louvre. The Mona Lisa became a global icon after one quiet theft on August 21, 1911. Vincenzo Peruggia, an Italian handyman, entered the Louvre wearing a white worker's smock. He blended with staff, waited for a lull, and slipped into the Salon Carré alone. With nobody watching, he lifted Leonardo's panel, removed the frame, and tucked it under clothing. Perugia walked out through a door like he was carrying supplies, not the world's face. The museum didn't even notice for more than a day because thousands of artworks filled halls. For over 2 years, the painting vanished while rumors raced across Europe like wildfire. In 1913, Perugia tried selling it in Florence, and the trail finally snapped into focus. The theft turned a respected portrait into the most recognized image on Earth, almost by accident. 11. Marie Antoinette chooses the giant carriage. In June 1791, France's royal escape failed because the getaway vehicle screamed royalty. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette planned to flee Paris toward loyal forces near the border. The route required speed, discretion, and quick horse changes without drawing attention from villages. Marie Antoinette insisted on a large berline coach packed like a moving apartment. It carried attendants, comforts, and luggage, and it moved slowly through narrow roads. Hours behind schedule, the party stopped often, giving curious locals time to stare and whisper. In Varennes, officials compared the king's face to coins and grew suddenly very confident. The family was arrested, returned to Paris, and the revolution's mercy evaporated soon after. One preference for comfort turned secrecy into spectacle and sealed a king's fate. 12. Fleming leaves the dishes unwashed. In September 1928, modern medicine changed because a scientist left a messy bench behind. Alexander Fleming worked at St. Mary's Hospital in London, studying stubborn Staphylococcus bacteria. Before a holiday, he stacked unwashed petri dishes instead of cleaning them properly. When he returned, he noticed a mold contaminating one dish, surrounded by a clear halo. The bacteria had died near the mold, like an invisible fence had been erected overnight. Instead of tossing it, Fleming isolated the mold and identified it as penicillium. He realized it produced a substance that killed bacteria, and he started testing carefully. Years later, penicillin became the first widely used antibiotic, saving countless lives worldwide. A vacation shortcut created a lab accident that medicine turned into a miracle. 13. Hitler's halt order at Dunkirk. In late May 1940, hundreds of thousands escaped Dunkirk because German tanks suddenly stopped. After a rapid advance through France, panzer units reached the outskirts of the port. The British Expeditionary Force and French troops were cornered against the sea, exhausted and exposed. On May 24th, Adolf Hitler issued a halt order, pausing the armored push for days. Commanders debated terrain, logistics, and Luftwaffe promises, while the trapped Allies dug in. Those hours became the thin window for Operation Dynamo to start assembling small boats. Civilians and fishing vessels joined Navy ships, turning evacuation into a strange armada. About 338,000 soldiers were lifted off beaches under fire, an escape nobody expected. A stop sign in a war room became a lifeline on sand, and Britain kept fighting. 14. Rommel leaves for his wife's birthday. On June 6, 1944, Germany's Atlantic defenses stumbled while their top commander was away. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel oversaw fortifications in Normandy, expecting an Allied invasion soon. Terrible channel weather convinced him the landing would be delayed beyond the early June window. On June 5th, he drove to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. He also planned to meet Hitler about releasing more panzer divisions for defense. At dawn on June 6th, Allied troops stormed beaches as the longest day began. Rommel's absence mattered because German reserves required high-level authority amid rigid command politics. He rushed back late, by which time the Allies had secured critical footholds ashore. A birthday trip, a weather bet, and slow approvals combined into history's most costly commute. 15. JFK removes the bubble top. On November 22, 1963, a clear sky helped turn a motorcade into a shooting gallery. President John F. Kennedy rode in a Lincoln Continental through Dallas, Texas, waving at crowds. Earlier rain had prompted a transparent bubble top to be available for the limousine. It was not bulletproof, but it reduced sightlines and complicated any long shot. As the weather cleared, Kennedy reportedly preferred an open car so people could see him. Security removed the top, and the procession rolled through Dealey Plaza at midday. Shots came from the Texas School Book Depository, and panic hit like a sudden storm. Whether the plastic would have changed everything is debated, but angles definitely would shift. A small decision for visibility traded a little protection for a wide-open target. 16. Stimson saves Kyoto from the list. In 1945, Kyoto avoided atomic destruction because one official refused to treat it as a target. U.S. planners considered Kyoto, Japan's ancient imperial city, for its size and psychological impact. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had visited Kyoto before and valued its cultural significance deeply. During summer meetings, he repeatedly objected as the target list moved between desks and generals. President Harry Truman ultimately agreed, and Kyoto was removed from the final selection. The bomb scheduled for another city went to Nagasaki, struck on August 9, 1945. Kyoto's temples, streets, and libraries survived the war, carrying centuries forward into peacetime. Stimson's insistence was personal, political, and strategic, all tangled together in one choice. One man's stubborn no saved a city's heart even as the war ended brutally. 17. Caesar crosses the Rubicon. In January 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed a shallow river and shattered the Roman Republic. Roman law forbade a general from entering Italy with an army, and the Rubicon marked that line. Caesar faced prosecution and humiliation if he disbanded, so he stalled and weighed options. Then he marched the 13th Legion across, signaling open defiance against the Senate. Ancient writers report he declared the die was cast, embracing the point of no return. Civil war followed, pulling Rome into years of bloodshed between old institutions and new power. Caesar's victory concentrated authority, and the Republic's checks cracked under personal loyalty. After his assassination, the chaos paved the way for emperors and an imperial system. A creek in northern Italy became the border between politics and permanent conquest. 18. Calpurnia's dream and Caesar's ego. On March 15, 44 BC, Caesar died because he refused to look scared. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of blood and begged him to avoid the Senate that morning. Caesar felt ill and considered staying home, a rare pause for Rome's strongest man. Conspirator Decimus Brutus arrived and mocked the idea of fear guiding a dictator. He hinted the Senate would offer Caesar extraordinary honors, baiting pride like a hook. Caesar changed clothes, left his house, and walked into the theater of Pompey. Inside, senators surrounded him, and knives appeared from sleeves with practiced calm. A single taunt turned caution into a death march, and Rome's future snapped sideways. 19. Waylon Jennings trades seats with the Big Bopper. On February 3, 1959, rock and roll changed because one seat swap fell. J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, had a fever, so Waylon Jennings gave him his seat. Ritchie Valens won another seat in a coin toss, and the lineup locked suddenly. The plane left Clear Lake, Iowa, and crashed minutes later in bad weather. Hawley, Valens, Richardson, and pilot Roger Peterson all died in the snow. Jennings carried guilt for decades, remembering the last jokes traded before takeoff. A kind gesture on a freezing night became the hinge point for music's saddest legend. 20. Columbus follows the birds. In October 1492, a course change guided by birds decided where Europe collided with the Americas. After weeks at sea, Christopher Columbus faced exhausted crews and rising talk of mutiny. On October 7th, he spotted flocks of land birds flying southwest, not random seabirds. Sailors knew birds often meant nearby land because migration tracks don't cross empty ocean forever. Columbus altered course from due west to west-southwest, gambling his reputation on feathers. Days later, the ships reached islands in the Bahamas rather than Florida's coastline. That landing shaped early Spanish routes, claims, and the first wave of colonization patterns. Small navigational choices then echoed through maps, languages, and borders for centuries afterward. A few silhouettes in the sky redirected an empire's first footprint on a hemisphere. 21. The Hindenburg's sharp turn. On May 6 of 1937, the Hindenburg burned at Lakehurst and passenger airships quickly died. The German Zeppelin approached New Jersey after storms delayed landing and nerves were already frayed. Captain Max Pruss chose aggressive turns to line up faster with the mooring mast. The maneuver stressed the rigid frame, and investigators later suspected a wire snapped in the tail. That could have torn a hydrogen gas cell, releasing fuel into an enclosed structure. Film cameras captured the inferno, making the disaster impossible to forget or minimize. 36 people died, and public trust in hydrogen air travel collapsed almost overnight. One hurried decision during a landing approach turned a marvel into a floating bonfire. 22. The Louisiana Purchase. Fine. Take it all offer. In April 1803, the United States doubled in size because Napoleon needed cash fast. American envoys came to Paris hoping to buy New Orleans and secure Mississippi River access. Napoleon faced war with Britain and the collapse of French plans after setbacks in Haiti. Instead of haggling over a port, he offered the entire Louisiana territory, stunning everyone. The price was $15 million for roughly 828,000 square miles, a bargain by any era. The Americans accepted quickly, fearing he would rethink it after one better morning. The deal transferred vast lands from France to the United States on April 30, 1803. That purchase reshaped borders, migration, and future conflicts from the Rockies to the Gulf. A diplomatic shopping trip became the biggest impulse sale in modern political geography. 23. The Rosetta Stone set aside. In July 1799, a builder's curiosity produced the key to reading ancient Egyptian writing. Near Rashid, called Rosetta by Europeans, French soldiers rebuilt a fort during Napoleon's campaign. Officer Pierre-François Bouchard noticed a dark stone slab covered with 3 different scripts. Most rubble became construction material, but he told men to set this carved stone aside. Over time, that work unlocked hieroglyphs, opening pharaohs' names, histories, and prayers again. The artifact eventually traveled to Britain after French defeat, sparking decades of study. One stone spared from a wall became the dictionary page that resurrected a silent civilization. 24. Thelphile's first by hours. On February 14, 1876, a few hours separated a household name from a footnote. Alexander Graham Bell filed a patent application for a speaking telegraph at the U.S. Patent Office. That same day, inventor Elisha Gray filed a caveat describing a similar telephone concept. Both men had been racing toward the same idea, transmitting speech over electrical wire. Bell's paperwork arrived first, and patent law cares deeply about timing, not fairness. Years of courtroom battles followed, but Bell's claim held, and his company surged forward. Gray's name faded, despite strong evidence he was a serious competitor and innovator. A single morning turned into billions of dollars, tangled lawsuits, and schoolbook fame. In invention history, minutes can matter more than genius, because paperwork decides the trophy. 25. The Leaning Tower engineers just keep building. The Leaning Tower of Pisa exists because builders refused to admit the ground was winning. Construction began in 1173, and by the 3rd level, the south side started sinking visibly. The soil was soft, the foundation shallow, and the lean grew like a slow-motion fall. Instead of restarting elsewhere, engineers kept building and tried compensating with uneven upper floors. That created a subtle curve, not a straight lean, like a banana frozen mid-bend. Work paused repeatedly over nearly 2 centuries, hoping the ground would settle and behave. It never fully did, and the tower became a permanent monument to stubborn persistence. Centuries later, engineers stabilized it carefully, while tourists posed like they are holding it up. A bad building site became a worldwide postcard because nobody wanted to say, "Start over." 26. The mayor who went back to bed. The Great Fire of London spread in 1666 after the city's top official shrugged. Early on September 2nd, 1666, flames broke out at Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. Night wind pushed sparks toward wooden buildings packed tightly inside the old city walls. Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth was dragged from sleep and told to order demolitions nearby. He looked at the blaze, dismissed it as manageable, and returned to his bed. By sunrise, fire had jumped rooftops, and bucket lines looked like jokes against embers. Over 3 days, about 13,000 houses and dozens of churches were destroyed across London. People fled with carts, pets, and bedding, while the sky glowed orange for miles. One tired decision turned a bakery problem into the defining urban disaster of an era. 27. Mahalia Jackson shouts, "Tell them about the dream." On August 28, 1963, a whisper from behind the podium helped create a defining speech. Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the Lincoln Memorial before about 250,000 people in Washington. He had prepared remarks about America's promises, carefully written and politically polished. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson stood nearby and had heard King riff on a dream theme before. As the moment peaked, she urged him to talk about the dream, pushing him off script. King paused, set notes aside, and began improvising, voice rising like a rolling wave. The imagery landed instantly, and the crowd responded as if the words were already famous. Television carried the moment worldwide, turning an improvised section into cultural memory. A single nudge from a musician turned a solid speech into an immortal one. 28. Vasily Arkhipov says no. In 1962, one Soviet officer's refusal mattered twice, and history rarely gives that chance. During the Cuban Missile Crisis on October 27th, submarine B-59 faced American depth charge signals. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed combat had begun and wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov supported him, and stress made the decision feel inevitable. Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff aboard, demanded they surface and confirm orders. He argued a launch without contact would be blind, irreversible, and likely suicidal for everyone. The submarine surfaced, eventually connected, and the crisis continued without a nuclear detonation. Arkhipov's name stayed obscure for decades, even though his decision was painfully public on board. Saying no in a steel tube, sweating in darkness, was harder than any heroic speech. 29. Stanley Lord doesn't wake the wireless operator. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, a sleeping radio operator became a tragedy detail. On the Californian Wireless Man, Cyril Evans had turned in after routine traffic ended. Bridge officers saw rockets and tried lamp signals, but radio silence stayed like a wall. Captain Stanley Lord did not order Evans awakened, even as uncertainty built on the bridge. In that era, distress calls traveled fastest by wireless, not by guessing at horizon lights. Meanwhile, Titanic's operator Jack Phillips kept sending CQD and SOS until power failed. Nearby ships received the messages and raced toward them, but ice and distance slowed rescue. The Californian eventually moved, yet the decisive hour had already bled away into freezing darkness. A captain's choice to let one man sleep became part of the disaster's bitter postscript. 30. A single misread map on D-Day. On June 6, 1944, landing chaos multiplied because maps and landmarks refused to cooperate. U.S. troops of the 101st and 82nd Airborne were dropped at night over Normandy. Clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and pilot confusion scattered planes far from intended drop zones. Paratroopers landed in flooded fields, hedgerows, and random villages, often alone and disoriented. Some followed wrong roads, others used church steeples and canal lines as improvised navigation. Small groups attacked objectives anyway, cutting phone lines and ambushing German convoys unexpectedly. A few units seized bridges and causeways almost by accident, blocking counterattacks toward beaches. The chaos was terrifying, yet it also created confusion for German defenders expecting tidy plans. One night of navigational mistakes produced 1,000 tiny battles that still helped the invasion work. 31. The Challenger O-ring launch decision. On January 28, 1986, Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch, in full view of America. Engineers at Morton Thiokol warned cold weather could stiffen rubber O-rings in booster joints. Temperatures at Cape Canaveral were unusually low, with ice visible near launch structures. During a tense call, some managers pushed forward, worried about schedules and public pressure. Concerns were debated, charts were shown, and the final recommendations shifted toward launching anyway. At 11:39 a.m. local time, the shuttle lifted off with schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe on board. Hot gases escaped through a failing joint, and the vehicle disintegrated above the Atlantic. The disaster grounded the shuttle program and exposed how organizations can normalize danger quietly. A rubber seal, a cold morning, and a yes decision created one of spaceflight's darkest seconds. 32. Chernobyl's safety test that wasn't safe. On April 26, 1986, Chernobyl's Reactor 4 exploded after a test spiraled out of control. Operators near Pripyat, in the Ukrainian SSR, attempted a turbine rundown test during the night shift. Power dropped too low, and they disabled safety systems to keep the experiment going. The RBMK reactor design was unforgiving, and unstable conditions built like pressure behind a door. Control rods were inserted, but their design initially increased reactivity, a deadly surprise. A rapid power surge followed, then steam explosions tore the reactor apart and exposed graphite. Firefighters arrived without knowing the radiation hazard, battling flames on roofs and around debris. Radioactive material spread across Europe, and Pripyat was evacuated only after crucial delays. A box-checking test became a chain reaction of human decisions colliding with bad engineering. 33. The Soviet Union shoots down KAL-007. On September 1, 1983, 269 people died after a civilian jet strayed into Soviet airspace. Korean Airlines Flight 007 flew from New York to Seoul with a stop in Anchorage. For reasons still debated, it drifted off course and crossed sensitive areas near Sakhalin. Soviet air defenses scrambled interceptors, believing the aircraft could be a U.S. spy plane. Pilot Gennady Osipovich in a Sukhoi Su-15 ultimately fired missiles at the Boeing 747. The plane fell into the Sea of Japan near Manaran Island, leaving no survivors. Families learned the news through cold announcements, while governments traded accusations and denials. The incident intensified Cold War tension, already high weeks after other alarming confrontations. A navigation error became a geopolitical explosion, measured in lives and mistrust.